a while.
Okay, everyone, we'll start. Welcome to this very special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman. I am a professor of public administration in the Andreas School of Business and in the Department of Public Administration at Barry University in Miami, and the co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Luis Fleischmann and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, such as this evening's webinar, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. Our core values of diversity, balance, and community define us and set us apart from other organizations. As an organization, we value diverse voices and views and see it as a means to create a healthy debate. The center provides a balanced platform where civilized communication, exchange of ideas, and inclusion prevail over party politics and dogmatic views. Our objective is to be a community and a place of gathering for academics, professionals, elected officials, decision makers, and civil society groups and leaders. So please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. On the site, you will find links to our past webinars. Recent webinars include a program on cryptocurrency and its connection to foreign policy, academic scholarship versus ideology, the intersection of national security and the Florida tech ecosystem, analysis of the Middle East peace process, and many more. On our website, you will find a donation button. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Through your generous donations, we are able to bring you important and timely programs and articles. Tonight, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is thrilled to present a compelling webinar titled The Future of Democracy. And yes, this is a very timely issue. We are so honored to host Dr. Alvin Felzenberg and our moderator, Dr. Sean Foreman. Shortly, Dr. Foreman will introduce Dr. Felsenberg. But first, I now welcome Dr. Luis Fleischmann, co-founder of the center. Dr. Fleischmann is the author of the 2013 book, Latin America in the Post-Chavez Era, The Security Threat to the United States. As such, Luis is an expert on authoritarianism, illiberalism, and de-democratization. So Luis, when you complete your short remarks, please turn it back to me so I can introduce Sean.
Yes, well, in fact, thank you so much. And I'm so glad to see so many new faces. And I'm glad to see some known, recognizable faces too. I want to expand a little bit on what Steve actually pointed out. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy was created for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the need to build a forum of local academics, retired professionals, former politicians, retired government officials, etc., to create a forum to exchange ideas. Now, we felt, Dr. Sussman and I felt, that the polarization of society required a forum where different ideas could establish a decent and civilized dialogue on any subject, whether it is domestic, it's on domestic policy or foreign policy, whether it is a local affair, national affair, or an international affair. Secondly, the center was established out of great concern for the deterioration of liberal democracy in the world, from left-wing regimes to right-wing regimes, from South America to Eastern Europe, and even concern over the rise of illiberal parties in the Western world. We were also concerned about the growing influence of Russia and China in promoting non-democratic values and agendas in the global sphere. Last but not least, we were concerned about the deterioration of public discourse and the emergence of right-wing and left-wing radicalism in our own country. Tonight, we are dealing with an important topic, and we have an important speaker featured tonight. And the topic that we are discussing tonight is directly linked to that mission on to the foundations of the Center for Democracy and Policy Research. So without further ado, I call again on Dr. Sussman to introduce the moderator, Dr. Sean Foreman.
Thank you, Luis. Dr. Sean Foreman is professor of political science and chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Barry University in Miami. Dr. Foreman is the co-author of 7 books, including 6 in the Roads to Congress series. I believe his most recent book in that series is titled Campaigning in the Era of Trump and it's subtitled Campaigning in the Era of Trump and COVID-19. Dr. Foreman graciously agreed to moderate this evening's webinar. One last bit of house cleaning before I turn it over to Sean. We welcome your questions. We want your questions. You can write your questions in the chat box if it's working. I think it is. After Dr. Felsenberg's remarks, you will be able to raise your virtual hand, that virtual hand, if you have a question, and we'll call on you. So, Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sussman. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Luis. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our esteemed guest speaker this evening, and so I will get right to that. Part of this actually comes from Wikipedia, but I love the introductory paragraph, and that is that Alvin S Felsenberg is an American author, columnist, consultant, educator, historian, public official, and spokesperson. A resident of Palm Beach, Florida, and Washington, D.C., he served on the 9/11 Commission, and he's written several books on American history and biography. Those include A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William Buckley Jr., and The Leaders We Deserved, and a few that we didn't, Rethinking the Presidential Rating Game. We can probably ask him about those later, as well as Keys to a Successful Presidency, and another book that he wrote, From the New Jersey State House to the 9/11 Commission, on Governor Tom Kean. And so Dr. Felsenberg worked with Governor Kean as an Assistant Secretary of State in his administration in the state of New Jersey. He later served 2 presidents. He served in the Departments of State and Defense, and significantly as the principal spokesperson for what was called the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, what we know as the 9/11 Commission. Dr. Felsenberg is a prolific author of columns as well. He is a fellow at the Institute at Harvard University. I want to mention that he has taught at Princeton, Yale, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington universities, as well as the University of Pennsylvania for the past decade. And Dr. Felsenberg received his BA and MA degrees from Rutgers, got another MA and his PhD in politics from Princeton. And so that's who we are hearing from tonight. with perspective on the future of democracy. I'll save any other comments or questions that I have until later. We already heard the housekeeping. We certainly encourage questions. I'm going to be calling on people. You can either raise your virtual hand on the system or raise your actual hand or politely cut in when we get to the question and answer time. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Alvin.
You are mute, Alvin. Alvin, unmute yourself.
You're muted, Alvin.
Alvin, you are muted.
I'm sorry. All right, I apologize. Technological skills are not mine, but anyway, I did it. Thank you. I want to thank Steve. I want to thank Louise, and want to thank Sean for being moderator tonight. This is a distinguished group. I know a little bit about some of you. All of you can be the speaker here, and I want that to happen. I'm going to talk a short minute or so, not a minute, a little more. Bad news. But I really want to open this up. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Any of you can talk about democracy. When I worked at the White House and the State Department and other places, it's the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Democracy was on the rise. Leonard Bernstein brought his symphony down to the Berlin Wall and played that wonderful concluding oral part of the Beethoven's Ninth. People were dancing in the street. George Bush declined, President George Bush declined to go. He didn't want to rub Gorbachev's face in it, he said. He didn't want to gloat. He looked forward to a post-Soviet world. And a lot of democracies grew. And once again, the idealism of America and the American people was tapped. We sent, I don't know how many technicians, city managers, university deans, union organizers, to bring to life these aspects of democracy that are not always in the government, but that de Tocqueville marveled over when he came here and saw how America worked. The smallest town near a tiny railroad with 5 people in it would suddenly have a library board and suddenly elect a government, have a volunteer fire department, and all these things that were really done by individual initiative. These nations, some of them had democracy for a short time between the wars. Most of them, we were dealing with absolutism and even worse, in Russia itself, totalitarianism. We took a lot for granted. Democracy is not self-starting and it's not self-enforcing. We've been through a lot of shocks in our lifetime. I think Luis and Steve and I and some of you are roughly about the same age. We've been through assassinations in our time, including of a president and presidential candidates and a civil rights leader. This urban unrest in the cities in the middle of the 60s. We've been through Watergate, we've been through Vietnam, and many other shocks in our system. We never thought we would be on the verge of, let's say, losing our democracy. I don't want to overstate it, but to see our own democracy in need of shoring up. When we had done so much, we can go back to the Marshall Plan even to shore up others and to see that freedom was on the march. We forgot about a lot of things, as I was pointing out to my students last winter with the collapse of Hong Kong and China's refusal to keep its agreement that this would be a 50-year experiment of one state and 2 systems. And we tend to think that everything is a question of voting. You can have forms of democracy without the substance. They vote in Russia all the time. They just have predetermined outcomes. They didn't vote in Hong Kong when it was a British colony, but I think you'd all agree with me that had many more what we would call human freedoms than they have now. Churches were open, synagogues were open. You can probably get a newspaper in Hong Kong anywhere in the world. The internet was beginning to flourish in the last couple of years before they stamped down. Young Chinese were talking to people all over the world about investment and about education, about ideas, all that came to an end. They were freer under Britain. The point I'm making is not that I like British colonies, but I'm saying sometimes you can have the form, not the substance, or the substance without the form. Unfortunately, they have little of it there right now. But all right. So we took it for granted in our country. We kind of came to this sense that that great Madisonian system that many of us teach about, many of us praise, is what kept democracy alive. Madison understood, and his colleagues understood, the frailties of human nature, that people are greedy, they're avaricious. If left alone, they will try to aggrandize as much as they can for themselves or their family or their faction or whatever, their region, whatever else. Came up with this wonderful system of checks and balances, which often have frustrated some of our politicians, but in some ways, they did get us as far as we came today. We all know what they are. You divide power into 3 branches, and then you divide the legislature into 2 branches, a Senate and a House, answerable to different or sometimes overlapping constituencies, senators at the state level, congressional by districts, and you have a president and you check him, and then you have the states that are supposed to pick up the functions. Why the divisions? Madison liked the divisions because he said that this would frustrate the possibility of one faction trying to take over all the branches, all the roots of government, and issue a dictatorship unto its own. They write this many times in the Federalist Papers. Well, the first time in at least my lifetime, we're on the verge now with social media being what it is and everything else, for one faction to try to get into every nook and cranny to see where the weaknesses in the system are, so that it can, I'm going to try to deal with this chiming, I turned it off yesterday, we'll try it again, that it can dominate the others. And I'm afraid this is where we are now. They haven't succeeded at it yet, but every day is another story. It's not just January 6th and the opportunity to try to overdo a rightfully decided presidential election, where appeals went on. You know, why do we have this long transition in this country? When they have it in the UK, some of you may have been there or seen it. When it happens, the election is held, it's called, the outgoing prime minister hands the king, well, now the king, his resignation, and the new person is asked to form a government, moves right in. Here we have the clunk, clunk, clunk. And again, first time in my lifetime, we didn't have a peaceful transition. We didn't have an orderly transition. And it has not been, I would say, the same since. I never thought that would happen in our lifetime. That was also, I think, the 4th time in our nation's history where the outgoing administration did not participate in the inaugural events welcoming the new president. Even though President Obama was very gracious to Donald Trump, you may remember that scene. All the ex-presidents were on the stand. And the first thing Donald Trump said, looking out at that great mall that Ronald Reagan said was the home of giants, Trump said all he saw was chaos. I mean, that was the legacy of his 4 predecessors who on the stand. I frankly thought of the sacking of Rome, but we'll leave that be what I was thinking. A lot has been challenged, a lot we have taken for granted. I think we've come to regret that. Most of us go to vote, at least in other years, and we assume, first of all, we know few of the people in the polls, unless we know our neighbors who are online with us. There are men and women that were willing to help us vote. We have to give a card to one, and then we go to the machine with another. Most of us assume that our vote will be counted. Most of us assume that the people we're dealing with are honest. Most of the people who were manning the polls, and you all know them, they're World War II veterans and grandmothers and dead mothers and people who make the community go, or college students like me, For 4 years in my undergraduate days, I manned the polls for all of $40. I wonder what they're paying them now. No, I wasn't in it for the money, for God's sakes. We would toss a coin to figure out which of our, two Republicans and 2 Democrats, which of us got stuck with going for the donuts twice a day. It's a long day. You show up at dawn, you pick up these heavy voting books, you all sign them. And then at the end, you got to schlep them back to the city hall and wait in line as they're checked in. But we never doubted that any of that would work. We saw a great threat last time around. This is even before January 6th, if you remember them. We heard all these questions about the post office designing systems to make vote by mail less efficient. We heard about the Postal Service destroying sorting machines that were more efficient so they could tie things up a bit. We saw precincts change with very little notice. We saw these drop-off boxes they have at some of the town halls and town clerk offices either disappearing or being shut down, or new rules are being changed and how this works. We've passed all kinds of regulations since about not being able to serve people bottled water while they're waiting in the hot sun to vote after we've reduced the number of precincts in certain places. Everything we took for granted is suddenly on the line. When I worked for Governor Kane the first time out, when I was Assistant Secretary of State, we had several divisions in the department. Only one was the election division. That was the one that I must say had the fewest problems. It took the least of my time. The others were cultural organizations. There were corporate filings. There were a couple of small record-keeping parts of the government, and there were functions we were forced to carry out by law, or compelled to carry out by law, in conjunction with the governor's office. But the idea that if we saw, you remember the last hearing we had, we're gonna have another one tomorrow of the January 6th commission, but the last one, we had 2 women talked about being intimidated, having death threats, having people follow her to her grandmother's house and all the tyranny. I mean, now the story yesterday, they're having a hard time getting people like some of you and some of your parents, if they're alive, thank goodness, retirees, and high school kids like me, college students like me, willing to sign up and do this. You didn't sign up for combat pay, even if the $40 has now been tripled and quadrupled and whatever. You signed out because this was part of making America go. There was a real problem with this. We used to have what we call policy elections. We fought over healthcare. We fought, I mean, is it a government function? How much of a function? How much in the states? How much in the federal government? All right, legitimate argument. Fought about taxes. We're still fighting about infrastructure. How much, where, what cost. We argued about quality of life, and certainly the domestic towns. Pollution were an issue. Climate change is still an issue. All these things are on the ballot now and on people's minds, as they should be. Abortion is back. We thought we had settled that issue more than 50 years ago. All right, but now we have one party, and I hate to say it, but it seems to be the case. Former president says it's himself, that the only election that he considers valid are ones he wins, because he's so wonderful that the only way that he could possibly lose is through fraud. And when he didn't get the landslide that he thought he was getting, he even alleged fraud in the last go around, when Hillary Clinton received 3 million more votes than he did in the popular vote. And he got his votes in the right number of counties in a very small number of states, so the Electoral College worked in his favor. I can explain how that Electoral College works, but I think you all know. But they worked in his favor. Well, so he even alleged then that there was enough fraud, but not enough to take the election from him, because he didn't get his landslide. This time, he lost in the same way that he won, except he lost in a certain amount of counties in the 4 states that we've been hearing so much about since January 6th: Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and There's one I'm thinking about. There were four of them. I'll come up. One of you will remind me. All right. And he lost by 6 million as opposed to 3 million. And now we have candidates running for governor, 2 states I will remember. Georgia. Georgia. Oh, wait, that's the 4th state. We have a candidate running for governor in Pennsylvania and Arizona. What is their platform? I have no idea what they would do about healthcare, what they would do about education, what they would do about environment, taxes, and all the rest of it. They are telling us, if elected governor, I will see that no Democrat is certified for having carried the state in a presidential election, no matter what the voters do. Well, another threat, there is a court case coming up in the next Congress. It's called the super legislature argument. The Constitution, by the way, it's an interesting document. Our party system can trace its roots to a great division between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and versus Alexander Hamilton as to how do you read the Constitution. Jefferson took a view that strict construction is what you read. If they don't prescribe a certain path, you can't do that power. Hamilton believed in a broader interpretation of the Constitution. We heard some of this in the court's recent decision on abortion, where they said they couldn't find a right to privacy. I won't get into that case again, but they didn't see the word privacy. So are we then to assume that the American people have no right to privacy on any matter from the federal government? Well, we're going to find out. But it also says in the Constitution that in Article 2, where it talks about how the president is selected, it says the state legislature, not use the word governor, not use the word public, the state legislature will decide in a matter it sees fit how to distribute the electoral votes in presidential elections. Wow. So none of those Madisonian checks and balances will exist in those particular states if these 2 governors win, who I'm talking about. And they're calling it a super legislature. So no checks and balances within the state, whatever the state constitution says. No application of the federal Constitution, 14th Amendment, and other guarantees in the federal document on this one matter. Now, it's not guaranteed, as you all know, that the people have a right to vote for president. But after a fellow named Andrew Jackson became president, well, I think let me go back a bit. I think you know that there are 4 elections in American history where the election was not decided, and neither went into the House or was decided some other way. If there's no majority in the Electoral College among the top 2 candidates, it goes to the House of Representatives. The House does not just decide. We keep hearing the Congress say, well, we have a Republican Congress or a Republican House or a Democratic Senate or the other way around. The House will vote. They don't vote as a House. It's every state 1 vote, 50 votes in the House of Representatives, if it gets to be that. And then the bargaining goes on. Well, Andrew Jackson had a plurality, had more votes than anybody else. The other contenders were John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, as the Speaker of the House, was a candidate. Now, Speaker has some influence. He pulled some of his buddies to vote for him. It was enough to put Adams over the top. And Adams is president. So, of course, Andrew Jackson is the first one to call corruption. I've been robbed. That was his campaign slogan for the next 4 years. I've been robbed. They called it the corrupt bargain. And Adams didn't help himself when he turned around and he made Henry Clay Secretary of State. It even pushed the Jackson argument a little bit. Well, as a result of that, most of the states began to broaden participation in their election process. Andrew Jackson is known as the great commoner, as the president that expanded the right to vote in most states. Most of the legislatures in the ensuing 4 years abolish their property owning requirement to vote, and we had universal white male suffrage. Well, ever since then, that's how the state and every state legislature then, by law, ceded their power to determine the electors to the public. And two slates of electors would appear. So when you voted in the last election, if you voted for Biden, you were electing for electors in the state of Florida who were pledged to vote for Biden. And if you voted for Trump, the same thing. I won't get into unfaithful electors and other chaos that can, again, you're really looking to create problems in the system. This can all break down. Let me just stop. I'm going to stop soon in a minute, but all of these Madison checks, they're all undergirded by a simple belief that you're going to have men and women of goodwill at the table here, that nobody's going to push the envelope too far. All believe that the constitutional structure and the republic that they have pledged allegiance to is more important than the immediate short-term outcome of any election or any dispute. Washington said in his farewell address, everybody thinks this is an isolationist speech. It's really not. Farewell address, that he leaves it to the American people to decide if they want to remain a republic, but a republic can only survive with the support of a virtuous people that will keep the politicians in check. Jefferson put it another way. He said, a nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. Well, the same idea, that an alert public will keep the politicians honest. And we were going and would elect the kind of politician with a certain amount of integrity. Well, before we get to what happened to that, you all know the story of the election of 1800. When Thomas.
You know what? I'm sorry, Dr. Felsenberg. I think.
You want to stop now?
Maybe we could, yes.
Yeah, well, all right. I can finish.
I think, okay, guys, if you wanted to get on 1800, but I thought I want to get their questions in. I'm going to pass it back to you here in a second, but if you see the chat, you saw the question in there that came in earlier, and it made me think. I think, you know, a lot of us, we teach Madisonian, we think that in K through 12, they're learning checks and balances. Right. Maybe they're not. Okay, but let's say they come out, they know it. But you just hit on what I was going to say. Aha. Yeah. But the people need to have virtue. The Benjamin Franklin quote as well. So what happened? How did we take it for granted and lose our democracy? That we as a people lost our virtue, or a few scoundrels are getting elected in these few places you've mentioned? What have we wrought?
Well, okay.
And is public education the key or the way back? Thank you. Okay. And then others raise your hands for other questions.
All right. I can finish the last thought, and I'll answer you. The election of 1800 was decided when two men, we don't have to go to the technicalities, Thomas Jefferson tied with Aaron Burr. They're both bitter opponents of Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton says, well, we're gone. You know, Adams lost, he's out of here. But we have votes in the Congress, we have votes in the House, and we picked the president. And a lot of the Federalists said, we ought to pick Burr because he'll make sure that he'll make deals with us. He's bribable. He will make all sorts. He'll sell out his grandmother if he has to be president. He craves power. And it was Hamilton who wrote a letter to the Federalist congressman, and he said, "I know Jefferson better than anybody else. I've tangled with him more than anybody else. I don't like him. I don't trust him. But in the end of the day, he will not sell the country out for his own causes. He will compromise. He will go slow. He will temper. Burr will not. Burr will be an emperor. And if you follow the rest of Burr's story, this is kind of how this ends. But back to you. We don't do a very good job, but we don't have this now because Donald Trump says, "I will do it all," and I don't want checks and balances. And what I say goes, and my people will. Like Martinet's. Remember when he actually stood up and said in one of his rallies that he doesn't like educated people. I love the uneducated. Remember that? He wasn't fooling. It's the Gong Show. It's entertainment. This is why we got these checks and balances. This is what they were fearful of. Their reading of history taught them Caesar did provide bread, circuses, all of that in exchange for their freedom. And they were writing in the back shot of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon and the Age of Terror. They had seen some of this going on while they were writing it. Well, our public got lazy. I don't know how many newspapers people follow a day. And if you really take Jefferson's command seriously, you're talking about it more than an hour, maybe more than 2 hours. All of the voters are not college professors. They don't have the time. A lot's going on. They want to delegate that to other people. We've had a lot of stress in our economy in certain parts of the country. We may not have been very aware of it in the age of Bill Clinton and globalization and NAFTA and service jobs coming in and high-tech jobs coming in, was manufacturing was galloping off to China and other places. If you took the train from Penn Station in New York City and went up to Canada on the Amtrak, you'll think you're going through Berlin in 1945. They were not bombed out. These were once very, very, very successful factory towns, mill towns, manufacturing base, all gone. No questions asked. The people were not retrained, investments were not made. And then we went ahead and we had two wars, not one, but two, with undetermined outcome, with, let's say, the children of the less educated fighting those wars and coming back with all sorts of other problems that they didn't have before they left. We have the opioid crisis, a great deal of distress in this country. There was a sense that people were not listening to them. You may know Roger Cohen of the New York Times, who now follows European politics. He took a trip to Kentucky and to Ohio, on both sides of the Ohio River, and he went to some depressed towns. And he knocked on a door that had a Trump sign. And he asked why they had a Trump sign. Well, come in, we'll have a cup of coffee over it. Turns out these are Democratic counties. They have a place like Allegheny County. We're not talking about the old Republican, Philadelphia story, Katharine Hepburn and her two beaux, Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant. What a great movie. We're not talking about those kind of Republicans. They talk about their martinis, their country clubs, and how they're going to fry Franklin Roosevelt. We're talking about the base of Franklin Roosevelt, Allegheny County, Schenectady, New York. Trump said that if you take the 5 boroughs of Manhattan out of New York State, upstate New York would have been his best state. How did we let that happen? What happened to the Democratic Party? Tim Ryan in Ohio asks us all the time. What happens to the Democratic Party? The lunch bucket Harry Truman Democrats, where they could get by on one worker's salary. And no, every housewife was not June Cleaver, but the ones who did not want to work didn't have to work. It was the difference between liberating women to express themselves and to contribute to the economy, and having to work, even if it's a waitress job, because your husband can't make ends meet on his own. We had the advent of television, where news became entertainment, and then the internet, where a lot of the civil disturbances I talked about earlier, they happened sporadically. They may have a combustion point is reached and suddenly Watts blows up, or an incident happens. In the case of the Newark riots, a policeman stopped a black taxi driver with an expired license. The neighbors came out. Next thing you know, the city is burning because the rumor went around that they had killed the taxi driver. They did not kill the taxi driver. But how does news spread in those days? All the neighbors were out and the city burned for 20 days. Now you can start a pretty good riot on your own telephone. You don't have to leave the house. You can organize it. I mean, it's unbelievable to me, but that's how we got here. And I'll end with, I want to take the other question. I'll end with, we don't do any civic education anymore. when we do it, it's the most boring thing we have. I mean, it's a great argument for people not to major in political science. You know how a bill becomes law? Right? You see all these organizational charts and, goes through this first video, yawn, yawn, yawn. They don't talk about human relationships. They don't talk about deals. They don't talk about compromise. They don't talk about the fact that we haven't balanced the budget in how many years? We never brought it in on time. I think it was twice when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich made their deal on welfare. I think we had a surplus for 1 year and George Bush blew it in the first 9 months out. Okay, we lost our way. And if anything good comes out of this, I think maybe Donald Trump became a wake-up call. If I'm wrong, we might be entering our last free election in 24, because they will be the side that does not want to concede will try to seize power. A final misconception. I started with Hong Kong. Let me end with Hungary. A lot of people think that Hitler came to power by seizing power. No, he didn't come to power the way Lenin did, or the way Mussolini did. Hitler came to power by using the defects in the Weimar Constitution to advance himself. And then they changed the laws in such a way that whatever he wanted to do that was illegal yesterday became legal today. Therefore, he was a constitutional chancellor. And as soon as he became the head of the country, there were no more elections. He had the legislature and they passed that. Going on in Hungary right now, where I asked some of you if you had a chance to read the piece in the New Yorker on Urban. He has this Fidesz party, which was begun by student dissenters from the Soviet regime. We thought they were Democrats. George Soros actually sent this young man to England to learn the language, and then he becomes the prime minister of Hungary, kicks George Soros out of the country. Doesn't like these ideas about freedom and philanthropy that he's been spreading around. But he has changed the law to make anything he wants to do constitutional. And they've gerrymandered the parliament in so many ways. You will know what gerrymander is. This was undergraduate class that I have to define. You know it, all know what it is. But in such a way that he can't ever lose a majority. Oh, that's legal. Just change the map. No blood was shed. And he's using the rural versus urban cleavage. He's using the word cosmopolitan, which you all know, that's a code word for certain groups within the public. He doesn't talk about diversity. He talks about the folk. And the Germany was the folk mention. He talks about folk mention are not going to give in to the elites, the cosmopolitans. Well, we see a lot of that here. And I don't consider myself an elitist, but I think every one of these anti-elitist messages we're getting out of Fox and other places is basically that. So why don't I keep quiet for a while and hear from some of you and answer some questions.
That was fantastic. I just want to make sure we hear from people. We're not done at all, but I want to offer, if they're not going to ask, I want to make sure we make use of our time. So voting machines, we're decentralized because we're by state, we're by county. Would it make sense to centralize more? Is that part of the problem, the different types of machines and mechanisms?
Well, I was praying after we went through the year from hell, which was the Bush-Gore recount, when Florida was handed to George Bush. He declared the winner by 500 votes, even though he lost the popular vote. I was hoping that Congress would assert its own power over federal elections. It has the power. It's right in the Constitution. They can't control Florida elections, but they can control their own elections. They can't have one uniform ballot for Congress. They can decide whether they want to do it by election machines, or they want to do it by mail, or they want to do it by cards, or whatever it is. They don't like to do that. We have this, I don't know what to call it, love affair with our state governments and our diversity in our political system. Though it's the luck of where you live is how easy it is for you to vote. And they won't. The one thing they did do, they did get rid of the butterfly ballot. Hurrah, hurrah. But Congress did not do that. Broward County did that. And they changed the ballot. It would be helpful. The lies being spread. I could teach a bunch of fourth graders tomorrow. Why is it that Donald Trump was ahead in so many states and then lost his final four as it became midnight or 2 a.m? Well, the answer is they opened the absentee ballots. They opened the mail ballots, and the machine was there and it registered to vote. And he was ahead and he was celebrating, or he thought he was celebrating. He knew he was losing. And so they make up these stories that there are all these boxes under the table. And Denise D'Souza, a dreadful person who Trump already pardoned, has a new movie out, 2,000 Mules. And it's about 2,000 people in the middle of the night came up and they found all these ballots like manna from heaven. And it was enough to defeat him. Well, baloney. The press do not put the time in. They don't check. They repeat. I have to say that I've seen this myself. They repeat rumors they saw in other people's newspapers. I'll give you one example. Nothing to do with America, so maybe it makes some sense. The Queen. We heard that the Queen Elizabeth, and her reign coincided with 14 presidents in the United States. And she met all but one. Well, I was waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, I had a chance to talk to a reporter. And I said, why doesn't anybody tell us who the one was? And well, who was the one? Well, the one was Lyndon Johnson. Okay. Well, then we get to, they could go to their own papers and get this answer. I mean, we have the internet now. All the major papers are indexed and they're all electronic. So what was wrong with Lyndon Johnson? Well, she didn't think anything was wrong with Lyndon Johnson. She doesn't do her own schedule. The British government does the schedule. And Johnson was having a little row with Harold Wilson, the prime minister. And Johnson said, we've been in World War I together. We've been through World War II together. We've been in Korea together. I want you to send some troops to Vietnam so it's not an American show. And he said, Mr. President, on that one, I can't do it. And Johnson did not want to publicize a rift with our special ally. And so he never paid call in London the whole 5 years he was president. And Harold Wilson did not allow the Queen to come to the United States. It wasn't anything else. Why don't they report that? It's not that, she wants to know who to have tea with. She doesn't make those decisions. Why do I have to explain it to somebody who's covering the Queen's funeral for some of the major networks in the world? I don't get that. Now, the same thing is true with voting. A rumor will start in one part of the country and somehow all the cameras go there. And that's the only thing that's going on for as long as they decide. So we need an attentive press as well. Until very recently, until Donald Trump came along, elections were not fun to cover. There was never any change. Ka-clunk, ka-clunk, ka-clunk. Lucille Ball in the chocolate factory. And at the end of the day, we'll tell you. Okay, well, we know it doesn't work that way. And they're lazy. It's part of it.
Luis has a question.
You're
Hello?
muted, please.
Luis, you have to take yourself off of mute.
It took me a while to find it. It's lower left.
I'm sorry.
You did what I did.
I see that Annalie Folders actually has a question before me, and then I'll proceed with my question.
Yes.
No, I was muted. I was going to leave that there on public education rather than ask him to answer that now. Maybe we should have a whole other forum on public education and civics. But, go ahead. I want to hear what your topic is.
Well, I mean, just I was thinking, and that's an idea that actually came about. Two things that I wanted to ask you. I mean, the first is, do you think that for a center such as ours, we could have a role in providing civic education? Let's say a talk such as the one that we are hearing now, which has so deep historical roots. Mm-hmm. Can we promote that civic education? That is one question. I mean, do you think it's possible if we wish it? I wish it. The second thing is the Supreme Court which is another. You talk about checks and balances, and I'm very concerned about certain decisions of the Supreme Court, which is not necessarily abortion, but for instance, gerrymandering, right? Gerrymandering basically was now is coming up again because of one case in Alabama, but thus far the Supreme Court, actually I'm talking about the Supreme Court even before we had an overwhelming conservative majority, still gave what is called ruled that gerrymandering is perfectly okay. Now, if we are having a situation where politicians can redraw districts, or as some people say, we pick the voters instead of voters picking us, okay? I'm talking as if I were a politician. Is this a problem in our democracy?
It's a terrible problem.
And by the way, gerrymandering is something that is being done by both parties, although the Republican Party does it more. But it's being done by both parties. And another thing that I wanted to remind everyone, just in case, is that Alvin Felzenberg worked for Governor Kane, and Governor Kane was a Republican, just in case, okay?
I work for
I happen to know him because I lived in New Jersey, an outstanding human being.
He was, well, I would say this if it didn't work for him. He was the best governor, probably since the country was founded, the best governor of our state. I mean, I can't say enough about him. Couple of things. Yeah, both Republicans and Democrats do it. By the way, gerrymandering happened from the day our country was born. The biggest conflict of interest around that the Congress decide where they run, what towns they have, as you said, the voters they have, and state legislatures do the same thing. Well, what happened to our friend James Madison? He produces this Constitution, it gets ratified, and the process goes on for a year, and suddenly we've got our first election, 1788. And he wants to be a senator. Patrick Henry controls Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist. The legislature decided who the senator was. He was upset that the state of Virginia lost power, had one of the strongest state governments, lost power to the federal government. Mr. Madison is not going to Congress, not going to the Senate, and he blocks him out. Then they draw a map. So he said, okay, I'll run for the House since the state legislature is keeping me out of the Senate. He runs for the House and he finds that Henry drew the map. And they were all of Madison's opponents are somehow in this congressional district. They had to work hard to do it. He did win narrowly, and it had a happy ending, as we have for it's happened from the start, is what I'm saying. And they both do it, and it's not only parties. But before we get to that, you mentioned Governor Kane in New Jersey. That's a state. He's not governor anymore. That's a state Donald Trump won by lost overwhelmingly. He got less than 40% of the vote in New Jersey. We have 15 members of the House. We have 2 Republicans. Well, but the Republicans got 38, 39% of the vote. Why don't they have 38, 39% of the seats? Works the same way in the legislature, in the state house. Well, because Democrats control both houses of the legislature, they drew the map. And the reason we call it gerrymander is because it's named after why was it that George Washington and John Adams, that's 12 years, they carried Massachusetts each time, landslides. How did the Jeffersonians get more seats than they would have by the percent of the vote? Because a fellow named Gary was the governor of Massachusetts, and he wrote the map, and the district that he was running in, or his friends were running in, looked like a salamander. So they wrote a cartoon in the Boston paper consisted of a salamander with Governor Jerry's head on it, and it became a gerrymander. We've done this in the beginning of the Republic. Congress does not, the courts do not like to get involved. I suspect this one may, and you may not like the result. Louis. But they don't, because they don't like to get involved in what they consider inter-party matters. The Constitution doesn't recognize parties. Parties are self-governing, and they're considered private entities, but they control the legislature. You're going to be a member of one or the other to do anything. If you don't think that's unique, let's take the city of Los Angeles. I don't know if you're reading about this. Biden asked 3 of its members to resign yesterday because they were making racist comments. You know what this is about? The city of Los Angeles is changing, just like Florida is changing. When you and I were growing up, white Angelenos and certain Jewish voters that had their origins to the motion picture industry who lived on the West Side, they were majority of Los Angeles. Their numbers have now shrunk maybe to 20% or less. And you have a city that has had substantial Black population, Hispanic population, and now Asian population. All the members of the Los Angeles Council are Democrats. Well, 30 years ago, the Black population was about 20, well, it was majority, 60% or so. It's much less now. It's 20% now. And they have, I don't know how many of the 9 seats, but Asians don't have many seats, and Hispanics are pushing their muscle. The fight that they happened to capture on a recording was over where the map should be drawn and who's going to give up power. You know of Maxine Waters, Black Democratic councilwoman from Watts. I mentioned Watts a moment ago. We're one of the great, well, not great, one of the most tragic race riots happened. When she was elected, it was overwhelmingly African-American constituency. African-Americans do not have a majority of that constituency. She wins because the Asian population and the Hispanic population don't seem to get together. But it's not a Black district by any way you would call it that. This goes on, they're all Democrats. And in Los Angeles City Councils, how are we going to draw the map so my side can win? The side here is not defined as party, it's defined as the ethnic group to which I belong. I don't have an answer. The only one who did have an answer was Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor. It's not a complete answer. He said that we should draw the districts in such a way that we get as many competitive seats as we can. That will mean that the nomination is less likely to go to the extremes on the left and the extremes on the right. And everybody will vote in the primary. So the idea that some of these things you're seeing now, that this man that's running for governor of Pennsylvania, he defeated moderate candidates to get that opportunity because all the Trump people came out and all the moderate people, I don't know, go to their golf game or whatever it was. The fringe comes out, the fringe nominates the candidate, and you don't have to worry about the general election. It's going on in New York. Jerry Nadler, 95% of his district is Democrat. I don't even know if they're running a Republican against him. It was drawn to be that way. And I have a very nice friend, has spent half a year in New York and half a year here. And she wants to know why Florida is becoming so red. And she's active in the Democratic Party in New York. And I said, well, you really cared about that, you would change your voting address to Florida. I mean, if there are no Republicans in the district, your friend Jerry is going to win anyway. You can make a big difference here. We have a couple of toss-ups. Well, he doesn't want to do that. Well, all right. It's a very complicated story, but Arnold found a way to do that. Retired judges, I hate to use the word retired professors, maybe some active professors, but people who don't have a direct stake in the outcome. And if you're a Republican or a Democrat and you sit in the state legislature, I don't think you should by law have a say in deciding where you run. It's a violation of the checks and balances as we know it, and it's a terrible disgrace. And the redder the district is, and the bluer the district is, the more power goes to the extremes, which is why the idea of bipartisan legislation, the kind of things that John McCain and Joe Lieberman used to put together all the time, have become few and far between. And I hate to say it, It looks to me like every time we have a divided government, meaning a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, or the other way around, as a matter of doing business, the majority party in Congress will impeach the president. And it basically takes that check away. Everybody expects it to happen. Nobody gets too upset about it. I mean, Trump was impeached twice, continues to be president. Clinton was impeached because Republicans overreacted. This can't keep going on, but it does because of the extremism. If you're in a Republican district and you vote to acquit Clinton, you're not going to be a congressman very long. And it's more partisan than it was.
Right. Well, the ones who voted, the Republicans who voted for impeachment mostly lost, of course. And, and we can envision if Republicans win the House, the impeachment of something against Biden next year.
I would add one thing. If you didn't get that, the Republicans have lost primaries. I think 9 people voted in the House to impeach Clinton. They took away Kinzinger's district. They split the district in 2. He's not running for re-election. All the others lost the primary, including Cheney. So the Trump base comes out and says, we don't want you doing that. We don't want you giving a fair trial to our side. We want to push the envelope as far as we can. And the Democrats will do the same thing.
I wanted to ask you about the January 6th commission. However, I'm mindful of our time. I see the comments in the chat. I wanted to allow the Steve Avila and Steve Sussman to make their comments or questions, and maybe you could have concluding remarks after that.
I want to hear from them. I want to hear the questioners.
Okay, good.
Did you call on me, Sean?
I'm sorry, I was going to have our Steve Avila go first, actually.
Oh, okay, yes, okay.
Steve's a popular name.
My middle name is Steve, by the way.
So we've heard the word democracy thrown around a lot tonight, and we all know the origins of the word demos, people, kratia, rule. And we know how the ancient Greeks practiced direct democracy, but the United States is a federal, presidential, constitutional republic. And from the very beginning of our country through Federalist Paper number 10, for example, and mobocracy, there's always been this discussion on the role that democracy plays in this country. We didn't even allow people to vote for senators up until the 17th Amendment. Are we just not meant to be truly democratic? Or were we at some point the closest thing to a democracy, but to quote what you said, we lost our way? What is a democracy so that we're not seeing headlines such as democracy is under attack or democracy is being dismantled? So basically, what is democracy, or how can we define it in such a way so that we're not seeing those types of headlines?
Well, it's a matter of definition, and I go back to the press again. They're calling them democratic institutions. Okay, they're free institutions. They're constitutional institutions that are supposed to make our system work and make checks and balances function, and not let one faction run the entire government, no matter who the party is. They didn't like democracy. They didn't want popular vote president. They thought voters could be bribed. They thought the ignorant would dominate. They thought demagogues, and this happened in our history. You send somebody out, the crime's been committed, and you get the angers going. You don't care about a trial. You don't care is innocent, guilty. Next thing you know, you have a lynch mob going on. It's a terrible history in our country. Anti-immigration is not a new thing. In Boston and in the 1840s, the targets were Catholics, and they would get mobs together and the Know Nothing Party and other factions, and they would burn down Catholic churches. They'd burn down meeting halls, schools, all of that. Passions. They wanted to govern the people's passions. They didn't want the mob. By the way, I'm going to give an assignment, some of you. Please rent the movie. You can get it on Netflix or anywhere. Probably get it for $1 on Amazon. All the King's Men. It's about Huey Long. And unlike our current ex-president. Huey Long didn't come for money. He was dirt poor. And he decided that he was going to organize the uneducated and promise them all these things in exchange for power. And he was the most corrupt governor in the state, and one of the few people that Franklin Roosevelt was actually afraid of. He was afraid that actually, if Long took this circus into the primaries, and he really got nasty, and he started talking about Roosevelt's disability, and he started talking about other issues that Eleanor was doing, and he would get a backlash. But there are speeches. The actor is Broderick Crawford. He gives a speech that actually I heard Trump give. He gives a speech to the downtrodden, or call them what you want, the uneducated. And he goes, they're coming after you. That's why they're coming after me. It's the only thing stopping the banks, the insurance companies, the oil companies, and these millionaires in Washington. That I'm standing between you and they. They want to get you. That's why they're coming after me. You got to protect me. You got to do what I say. And he could get a pretty good riot in his own way going. And there's a great deal of corruption and that make the state go. And of course, I won't give the whole movie away. Here you have our first billionaire populist, at least the United States. Huey Long didn't have a rich daddy. He didn't have buildings on Park Avenue and Wall Street. We have the first time, and I think some of you might agree with this, the first time that I know, President of the United States saw his role as leading a guerrilla movement against his own country. That if he can't rule, then he will ruin. He doesn't care. This is not an anti-Trump speech, by the way. I'm just quoting him. It's all about him, not about you. It's all about the 24 election will all be about, did he steal the last election? Not what will he do for you in the next 4 years? How will we come out in a better place? And I really hope that the American people begin to figure this out. I worry about it a lot. Back to George Washington, to make it work, you have to assume that the people you're negotiating with are honest and honorable men and women. If you're not, the system was built to be governed by honorable men and women who take no for an answer, who lose a case and say, that's that, pay the fine, who know how to drag out cases, who will look at every nook and cranny. I mean, it's been 2 months now since the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago. If you took one piece of paper home, you would have been in jail, no questions asked, and a fine, and probably never worked for the government again. He knows that he can get his people up in arms. He's threatened that if I'm indicted, it'll be a bad day for the country. He's threatening a riot again, the way we did on January 6th. And they want to be very, very careful how they go. But delay works against the system doing its job. And we'll see what happens after tomorrow. We'll see what happens in this case. That's why I brought up Huey Long. The last thing on his mind was a way to get help for his voters, but he did deliver things for his constituency to make them fight for him. And he was not averse to violence. The thing I didn't mention at the beginning, I said there was one party that does not accept the outcome of an election unless they win, but it's also willing to accept a certain amount of violence to achieve its goals. And recent polls of the two parties have indicated that. You see a big rise in the number of Republicans who would accept violence as a means of achieving their end. It's rising among Democrats. It's still a very small number, but it's rising.
Very poignant. Steve Sussman, let's get your question. I don't know how well we're doing in time overall. Go ahead.
I think we're running out of time, but I just, maybe it's more of a comment, and that is some of us in graduate school studied James David Barber.
Oh, yes.
Okay. And presidential character. But in your book, The Leaders We Deserved, not in a bad way, but I feel that I was cheated because I studied Barber and not your book.
Thank you.
Can you address that for 10 seconds?
Yeah, real quickly. I studied Barber as well, and Barber wrote in the aftermath of Watergate, and he was trying to say, he didn't say how do you stop a Nixon from getting to the top of the system, but he was beginning to say, how do you factor out certain personalities who have excessive power drives to the extent that they're going to cheat on the rules and break the law in a way to achieve their goals. How do you do that? And he came up with a typology. Well, what is it? Is it active? Is it passive?
Active, passive, is it active,
The active
passive?
positive.
Positive, negative.
Yeah.
So are we going to have active presidents or passive presidents? Well, since 1945, they've all been active. Or since 1932, they've all been active. So then what do you say? How do you distinguish a Franklin Roosevelt from a Richard Nixon? So he goes through all these things. It's not a matter of energy. It's a matter of affectation that they receive, the amount of joy they get at the game. Are they in the game to settle grudges? Well, Haberman says that's all what Donald Trump's about. Well, a lot of it's all what Nixon was about. Or is there a certain joy of the game, which is certainly what Roosevelt was about? You get some problems with Johnson, which is why I don't think the book helped us very much, because no one loved the game more than Lyndon Johnson. And nobody whined more than Lyndon Johnson. And woe is me, Lyndon Johnson. So I was trying to find out, how do you decide a great president? Barbara and I both had the same problem, that when Schlesinger came along and they would come out with the ratings of presidents and Look magazine or Life magazine every 4 or 8 years. And the same names are always there. They're beginning to change now because new historiography is happening. Okay. But it didn't tell you much. You say Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln were all great presidents. Well, define great. What do you mean? Do you like what he did? You would have voted for him? Or if you like what you did, Carter would have been a great president. Did everything the environmentalists wanted. He had an energy policy that made us self-sufficient. He was honest, running after Watergate. Well, it wasn't a very successful presidency because Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy, a lot of other people saw the world differently than Jimmy Carter. So I came up with 6 components. And well, they weren't all, do you agree with the guy or gal? Character still counts. The Greeks said that character is man's fate. Vision. I mean, what do they want the job for? Well, people like James Buchanan had no vision. They let the country drift, couldn't find any way to stop the Civil War, and didn't really care very much. No vision. Well, Johnson was vision galore. Roosevelt, Wilson they all had a sense of vision. Competence. Can you use the levers of power in such a way that you can advance your vision? And is it the right vision? And then I talk about 3 policies that no president can avoid. Management of the economy, national security, and the one that gets us all into trouble, furthering the American mission, which is the extension and preservation of liberty. Well, for whom? Jefferson Davis, as Lincoln pointed out, was fighting for the liberty to own other people. And I was fighting for a way to liberate people. I'm being simplistic, but that's what my book's about. And so there's a way to say, what do you do with Lyndon Johnson? I said the policies are in national security, the economy, and expanding liberty. What do you do with LBJ? He passes the greatest civil rights bill the country had up to that time. He basically ends apartheid in a third of the country. Comes up with the Medicare, Medicaid, finishes part of Johnson's agenda, of Roosevelt's agenda. And then you got this thing called Vietnam. So I said, well, why don't you give them grades like every college student knows? And I wrote this for college students. So you give them an A in biology and a D in French, if that's what it is. And I gave them different categories. So I give Johnson an F in foreign policy, and I give him an A in human rights, and somewhere in between. And then I come up with a score. That's how I spend my Saturday nights. And we argue about it. So that's what the book's about.
That was fantastic. This has been a really enlightening and informative evening. I know Luis has his hand up. I don't know if we indulge a final question or comment. The audience has been great. I know they have to be here all this time and be attentive. So Luis, I'm going to turn it over to you and then Steve to wrap it up here.
Yes. I think we need to, yes. First of all, Alvin, thank you so much. And thank you, Sean, for being such a wonderful moderator. But I wanted to ask you, I've been reading lately people, intellectuals, I'm talking about university professors,
Yes.
that reject liberalism. And they go all, in a huge, rejecting John Locke, rejecting liberalism altogether. And they believe that liberalism brought about political correctness, about the deterioration of marriage, about neo-Marxism, all kinds of things. I'm talking about professors. I'm not talking about Carlson Tucker or Tucker Carlson or anybody. And it's interesting because obviously, one thing that they say, and this is very interesting, and I think you mentioned something, Alvin, is what is happening. I mean, are we having a certain crisis of what is called our liberal democracy? Politicians cutting deals behind the scenes, on both parties.
Yep.
Because after all, Trump ran not only against the Democrats, he also ran against the Republicans.
Absolutely.
Okay. And we can remember that he ran against the Republicans. Now, that's not excuse for certain behavior that certain Republicans display now, but the idea is that, okay, politicians became corrupt, no longer responding to constituencies the way they used to, the issue of money going on in elections and basically politicians attending fundraising events more than they would listen to constituencies. Are we in a crisis that we can still reform our system or make politicians aware of what they do, let's say, and get back to the liberal democracy as it worked, I would say, fairly until at least 25 years ago?
Well, okay. Before
How do we fix it? To wrap it up, right? How do we fix it,
Yeah.
sir?
In
I
10
think-
seconds or less.
Yeah, what is the role? Because you say, well, defeating Trump, yes, defeating Trump, defeating everyone who is non-democratic, like the Pennsylvania governor candidate, this candidate in Pennsylvania and in Arizona. But the question is what the mainstream politicians can do. How can they reflect upon everything that has been happening?
Okay. Defeating candidates with fascist tendencies, which is what this is a down payment. It's not the whole house. No, it's not. You hit it a little bit with gerrymandering, even though we've always had it. Every district does not have to be 90% one direction or the other. I would tell you there are about 40, we have 435 seats in Congress. I hope some of the people on this conversation fill one of those one day. We have a much better Congress, trust me. But 40 congressional seats are competitive. 2 in Florida. We have 26 congressmen in Florida. 2 districts are competitive. Toss up. We don't know the outcome because the numbers of voters of each side are almost equal. I'd feel a little happier. We could have at least 60-40. Why do we have to have 90? We have my friend that still votes in New York. It's a wasted vote, whereas the Democratic Party is concerned, they've got her anyway. She could make a difference here. What would that do if we were less stringent with the 90-10 and forced to be less selfish, or had a different system like Arnold tried to do in California? If you're the 10% in a 90% Democratic district, or you're a Republican voter, you feel like you're behind enemy lines. Everybody says, your second grade teacher says you don't like what's going on in Washington, write a letter to your congressman. And your congressman's office is going to say, she's voting from a Democratic precinct in a Republican district. I don't need her anyway. Throw the letter out. Arrogance. She's paying a salary. She's a citizen and a voter like anybody else. They don't campaign there. They don't help with certain problems, whether they're not disasters or bad schools, whatever it is. They tend to shovel things to the people who voted for them. I take my hat off to Joe Biden because he came down to Florida knowing that he was visiting areas that didn't vote for him. We haven't seen that in a long time. I mean, Clinton did not spend a lot of time in Republican states, although he was less partisan looking back than it seemed at the time. You take care of your base first, and then you're using the resources of the entire country to bring about your own vision. That's one thing I would say. You mentioned civic education. Get back to that. I don't understand when 70% of the state in Florida opposes the Supreme Court ruling on abortion, why people are not up in arms, why people aren't marching on Tallahassee or marching on the legislative offices here that will have a say over what kind of enabling legislation Florida does have. We had a 22-week period for abortion. They're trying to limit it now to 15. 70% of the state say to the polls and the newspapers they liked Roe the way it was. Why aren't we hearing from them? Biden thinks that by coming up with a program for student debt, they'll get young voters. They're stupid enough to say that. Stupid enough to tell young people they think they can bribe them. They're doing it again with marijuana. Well, you know, what do they say about sex? Do it, but don't talk about it. But that's what they think. That's a very cynical approach to your own voters, even there. And so another person could rightfully say, well, then why don't you absorb my mortgage or something else that I've done? Why, you know, my car, I can't work without my car in a state like Florida. So why don't you take off my car loan? Why that? And why are you taking money from bus drivers and Uber drivers to pay somebody's cost of an education? Well, okay, but this is what you get into. Lyndon Johnson used to talk about being president of all the people. Whether they meant it or not, it did have the majesty of what pulled the United States through in World War II, the sense that everybody was in it together. There's a growing sense of cynicism that everybody's not in it together. You said it a minute ago, everybody's out to feather their own nest, or one of the two Stevens said this. That's what partisanship does. It dilutes patriotism. It puts faction over the whole. It puts party over country. And these are simple things. Before I end, I didn't answer your other question about civic education, and I'll be very quick about it. Yes, we can do a lot. We have people who have done a lot with their lives, who know a lot about government, know exactly what bored them when they were in second grade and didn't like civics and the rest of it. But I would first ask you all to pay attention to what is going on in Florida. There is a civic education program that's going to be mandated. I read somewhere that Hillsdale College has had a franchise in so many school districts to develop a curriculum. I don't know what that curriculum is. It gets us back to this question about some people call it the don't say gay law, whatever it is. Hearing about certain books that are not being considered appropriate for junior high school libraries. And they're not books that I necessarily think are sexually charged. We're talking about things like Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. We're talking about Catcher in the Rye. We're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. We're not exactly talking about Lolita or things that perhaps they can't handle at that age. So I would say, be informed of what is going on here and how is civic education being taught and what kind of things can help bring us together. Part of that is respect for other people, and you talked about diversity as one of the goals of the group. And you can teach the history of the United States in a way that does not make children feel guilty for things that were done before they were born. You can teach respect, and you can teach that we understand you're talking about your own family in some cases. We were a Confederate state or Confederate cemeteries around here. They fought with gallantry, but what they fought for was evil. But they were fighting for their homes. When General Sherman is burning down a house to end the war, bring down the Confederacy, he's not always asking, am I attacking a Republican house or a Democratic house? He's attacking houses because he wants to destroy Atlanta to win the war. It can be taught that way. And, 9-year-old kid should not have to feel that he's diminished because he had forebears in his family that did things that we don't like. And maybe we should figure out what it was like to be in a minority and treated in a different way. I think that's how you get to unity, and that's how you get to, we used to call it patriotism, but I mean, these things can be
terrific, Sean.
Yes, well, I think, it's messy, right? But it's better than the alternatives, and it's hard. And you told us that from the beginning, and we took it for granted.
Yes.
Democracy being, and here we are in the future, right? We have a lot of work to do. We appreciate all of the insight. I think we all agree this is preaching to the choir, right?
That's a problem.
We all agree.
We all travel in our communities. We're known where we live. Yes.
Yes.
I don't remember the president who said it. I wish they all did, but America is worth fighting for. And we have an election coming up, and it's worth fighting for. And it's worth eternal vigilance, the price of liberty. I mean, it's said 1,000 ways, but we can get our neighbors to care.
We have our marching orders. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. And Steve's gonna send us off for the evening.
Thank you, Sean. Two points. One is I want to thank Sean for moderating, stepping in when he had to, and all this. So wonderful, and it was you did terrific. And I hope this is not the last time we see you moderating. So, and Alvin, I want to say that simply put, you did fabulous because almost everyone stayed more than 30 minutes longer than the schedule.
Okay.
So that is a real thing here. It's not just saying you did great. Everyone's still here. I have tons of questions that I'll reserve for when you come back to do this again. And I'm sure others have lots of questions as well. So thank you very much. It was really an honor.
And I want to thank also the audience. I mean,
I
we have a wonderful audience.
Luis, I was about to, okay.
Okay.
All right. Luis and I are like a bad marriage, and we get along so well. So, but we would be nothing without the audience, without your participation, without your support as well. So, be sure to log on to the website if you're so inclined. We have a donation button. And we are a 501c3, so you will get a letter from us for that donation. And so again, thank you all. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Sean. Thank you all for coming. I wish I could acknowledge each and every one of you right here, and I should, but we're definitely out of time. We have our supporters as well, like Michael Landau from Philadelphia. Also, we have, I don't even want to begin because I'll mention everybody. So thank you again. And Alvin, thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Luis. And we will see you next time.
All right. You have my emails. We can continue it that way.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Okay.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you. Good evening. Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Luis, and the audience. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.